The telegram arrived at Evelyn Carter's dormitory room on a Tuesday morning, its envelope starkly official, the paper unusually thick. She unfolded it with trembling hands, the inked words seeming almost unreal. Asterisk, you are requested to report immediately to Arlington Hall for government service. Confidential. Asterisk. Her heart raced. Arlington Hall. She had only heard whispers of it from her professors, an impenetrable fortress of secrecy, where mathematicians and linguists worked to decode the world's most dangerous messages. Never in her life had she imagined she would be summoned to its doors. The world outside her small college town seemed mundane compared to the invisible battles she now sensed lurking in the shadows. Evelyn stuffed the letter into her notebook, feeling the weight of destiny pressing down. She was 19, brilliant in numbers and logic, but naive to the realities of war beyond textbooks. The news of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor 2 years ago had already changed America. Now the war had come for her, silently, without bombs or sirens, through a piece of paper and a summons she could not refuse. By train, she traveled to Washington, D.C., watching the rolling fields give way to sprawling suburbs and finally the heavy architecture of the nation's capital. Soldiers in uniform passed on the streets, their faces taut with purpose, radios blaring marching orders, and she felt both invisible and intimately connected to the pulse of war. She clutched her notebook as if it could shield her from the unknown, her mind racing through cryptography puzzles she had solved on her own, wondering if they had summoned her for her talent or for her potential. At Arlington Hall, Evelyn was met by a stern woman in uniform, her face tight with authority. "Evelyn Carter?" she asked, her voice crisp. Evelyn nodded. "Follow me. And remember," she added, "what happens here does not leave here." The facility was unlike anything Evelyn had imagined. Brick buildings rose amid manicured lawns, but the air was tense, charged with unspoken urgency. Women and men moved briskly, their faces a mixture of focus and fatigue, clutching papers and whispering in corridors lined with bulletin boards covered in encrypted messages. Machines hummed in distant rooms, their operations mysterious even to her. Every corner seemed alive with secrets, and Evelyn realized this was no ordinary office, it was a war zone in miniature, where intellect was the weapon, and silence was armor. Her first days were a blur of instructions, tests, and introductions. She met other recruits, women like Alice Chen, whose fingers flew over cipher sheets with uncanny precision, and Margaret Delaney, a former schoolteacher whose calm eyes seemed to absorb every detail of a code at once. Evelyn admired their skill, their quiet confidence, and she felt the first prick of fear, the fear of inadequacy, the fear that her intellect might not be enough. Yet, as she was led to her first workstation, Evelyn's nerves steadied. Before her lay a table strewn with papers, intercepted Japanese communications, coded messages from the Pacific, and German transmissions she could barely decipher at first glance. The letters, numbers, and symbols danced before her eyes, a challenge that thrilled and terrified her simultaneously. She had always loved puzzles, but these carried consequences far greater than any game or classroom exercise. Mistakes here could cost lives. Lives she might never meet, in battles she would never witness firsthand. Her first assignment was deceptively simple: match repeating patterns in a series of encrypted messages. Hours passed as she scribbled notes, cross-referencing letters, calculating frequencies, and testing theories. Her mind, normally scattered with academic distractions, honed into singular focus. By the evening, she realized she had identified a flaw, a minor key repetition that, if confirmed, could reveal the structure of the enemy's cipher. The thought sent shivers down her spine. She was touching the pulse of a war she could neither see nor hear. That night, in the dim dormitory provided for recruits, Evelyn lay awake thinking about her new world. The war had always seemed distant, something reported in newspapers and radio broadcasts, but here, in Arlington Hall, it was intimate, immediate, and suffocating. Every code broken, every message deciphered, had a tangible effect on the lives of soldiers and civilians alike. She felt exhilarated and terrified in equal measure. She was not wielding a rifle or a plane, yet she held a weapon just as powerful, knowledge. The following week brought her first collaborative assignment. She was paired with Alice and Margaret on a particularly challenging series of Japanese transmissions, suspected to contain troop movements in the Pacific. The three of them huddled over tables covered in slips of paper, pencils scratching, calculating probabilities and cross-referencing known patterns. Their conversations were low, cautious, each phrase weighed against the possibility of leaks. Evelyn felt the pressure tighten like a vice around her chest. She had never known work to be so thrilling and so critical. Days turned into nights, and nights blurred into early mornings. The facility ran relentlessly, and so did the cryptographers. Evelyn learned to live on coffee and adrenaline, her mind moving faster than her body. Breakthroughs were rare and often fleeting, but when they occurred, the elation was intense, a reminder that each small victory here could tip the balance of lives on distant battlefields. One evening, a supervisor approached Evelyn with a folded message. "This came in from Naval Intelligence," he said, his eyes narrowing. "They think we might be able to make sense of it. If you can, it could prevent a disastrous ambush." Evelyn felt a cold knot form in her stomach. The weight of responsibility pressed down harder than ever. She looked at Alice and Margaret, saw the same mix of determination and fear mirrored in their eyes. Together, they leaned over the cipher sheet, pencils poised. The room felt impossibly silent, save for the occasional hum of machines and distant footsteps. For hours, Evelyn worked, testing hypotheses, marking patterns, erasing calculations, and starting anew. Her mind burned, but she refused to stop. Somewhere in those symbols lay a truth that could save lives. By dawn, she began to see it, a subtle repetition, a pattern embedded in layers of obfuscation. Heart pounding, she whispered, "I think we've got it." Alice's eyes widened, Margaret leaned closer, and for a moment, they allowed themselves the briefest flicker of hope. It was a small victory, almost imperceptible, but in Arlington Hall, victories like this were monumental. Evelyn understood, in that moment, that the war was being fought not just with guns and planes, but with logic, patience, and courage born of the mind. She felt a thrill she had never known, the knowledge that her work, invisible to the outside world, mattered immensely. And as the sun rose over Arlington Hall, casting golden light across the brick buildings, Evelyn realized she was no longer just a college student. She was a cryptographer, a silent warrior in a war that could change the world. And she had only just begun. Breaking the first code. The hum of the machinery in Arlington Hall had become almost a heartbeat to Evelyn, steady and relentless, a reminder that the war was always moving, whether she was ready or not. She had barely slept the previous night, replaying every calculation, every potential mistake in her head. The victory over the first pattern had been exhilarating, but the messages coming in now were darker, more urgent. Something in the tone suggested high-stakes orders that could change the course of battles thousands of miles away. Evelyn walked down the corridor to the operations room, her coat pulled tightly against the chill. She passed rows of desks where men and women hunched over cipher sheets, their fingers tracing invisible patterns, their expressions rigid with focus. No one spoke unless necessary. Arlington Hall had a language of silence, punctuated by murmurs of triumph or frustration. Evelyn had learned quickly to listen with her eyes, reading tension and excitement in the curve of a brow, the twitch of a hand. Alice Chen was already at her desk when Evelyn arrived, the tips of her pencils worn down to stubs. "You'll want to see this," Alice said, sliding a pile of encrypted messages across the table. "This one came straight from Midway. Command thinks it contains fleet movements." Evelyn felt a cold rush of adrenaline. Midway. She had memorized the names of strategic locations in the Pacific, the islands and atolls, imagining tiny dots on maps, unaware of how many lives hung on the calculations of cryptographers. She opened the first envelope, and her eyes scanned the strange jumble of numbers and symbols. Unlike anything she had worked on before, it was layered, a puzzle designed to frustrate, to mislead, to keep secrets buried. Margaret Delaney joined them, carrying a mug of coffee. "We've got 12 hours before the naval team needs a report," she said evenly. Her calm demeanor was both reassuring and terrifying. Evelyn often wondered if Margaret ever slept. She seemed to operate at a constant, unwavering focus that Evelyn could only aspire to. The three women began their meticulous work. They plotted frequency tables, testing letters, numbers, and symbols against each other, looking for anomalies. The patterns were there, Evelyn could feel them, but they were buried under layers of deception. Each false lead they chased consumed precious minutes. A single misstep could misinform the Navy, send ships into ambushes, cost countless lives. Time passed unnoticed. Evelyn's pencil scratched across the paper, her mind shifting into a rhythm she barely recognized as human. The room around them faded. They were no longer in Arlington Hall but in the mind of an enemy strategist, tracing his choices, anticipating his logic, unmasking his intentions before he could act. Hours blurred into exhaustion. Sweat beaded on Evelyn's brow, and yet she could not stop. Each symbol, each sequence of letters, was a thread, and if they could weave them correctly, they could pull apart the enemy's entire plan. Finally, just past midnight, Evelyn noticed a subtle irregularity in the sequence. A series of characters repeated with slight variation, almost imperceptible unless one tracked them methodically. "Wait," she whispered, leaning closer. "This segment it's offset by 3. I think they're using a shifting key." Alice's eyes lit up. "Yes. That explains why the first 6 messages made no sense. They were misaligned by design." Margaret moved swiftly, recalculating the previous sheets with the new insight. Patterns that had seemed random now fell into place, revealing the structure beneath the chaos. The adrenaline surged. Evelyn's hands trembled as she filled in letters, translating numbers into words, sequences into instructions. What had been incomprehensible a few hours ago now formed coherent sentences, directives that revealed Japanese naval movements and timing. Every deciphered phrase felt like a lifeline thrown across the ocean, a beacon of knowledge that could save men on ships she would never see. But victory was never simple. Just as they began to piece the messages together, an error emerged, a misread character that threw part of the sequence into confusion. Evelyn's stomach tightened. "No, no, no," she muttered, erasing and recalculating. Panic brushed the edges of her focus, but she forced herself to breathe, to think logically, to trust the method. The stakes were too high for anything else. Alice and Margaret offered quiet encouragement, their presence grounding her. Hours passed. By 3 a.m., exhaustion weighed on every limb, but clarity had returned. They worked in silence, minds locked on the same objective. Finally, the last segment fell into place. Evelyn held her breath as she read the decoded message. It contained detailed instructions for a Japanese naval attack on Allied positions in the Pacific within 72 hours. The weight of their discovery pressed down on her. This was no longer a puzzle, this was intelligence with immediate, real-world consequences. A single ship diverted, a single attack prevented, and hundreds, maybe thousands, of lives could be spared. Evelyn's hands shook, not with fear but with the sheer magnitude of what she held in her mind. When they submitted their findings to the senior analyst, the room seemed to hum with a tension Evelyn had never known. Every word she had decoded could change the fate of the men at sea. The analyst nodded curtly, glancing at their calculations, then disappeared into a back office, presumably to verify the information. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Evelyn's mind raced with possibilities, imagining the chaos if they had misread the code, if a single symbol had been wrong. Finally, the senior analyst returned. His face was grave but tinged with relief. "Good work," he said, his voice low. "This message saved lives. The Navy has adjusted its positions based on your decoding. You three have made a difference." Relief washed over Evelyn, mingled with exhaustion. She slumped in her chair, realizing she had not eaten, barely moved, and had not spoken a word aloud for nearly 12 hours. Yet the satisfaction was profound. For the first time, she understood the quiet, invisible power of cryptography, the ability to influence events without ever being seen on the battlefield. That night, back in her dormitory, Evelyn stared out the window at the city lights. The world outside seemed unchanged, peaceful, unaware of the silent struggle happening in rooms like hers. She felt both insignificant and monumental at the same time. Their work was invisible, often unrecognized, yet its impact was undeniable. As sleep finally claimed her, Evelyn dreamed not of bombs or guns, but of sequences of letters and numbers, patterns forming and reforming, a delicate dance of logic and intuition. She awoke the next morning knowing the war had become personal, and that her role in it silent, unseen, and relentless was only beginning. The cost of secrets. The message arrived just after dawn, wrapped in a brown envelope stamped urgent, top secret. Evelyn's stomach tightened as she held it, sensing instinctively that this was no ordinary dispatch. The notes inside were fragmented, compressed, and encrypted more elaborately than anything she had ever encountered. Analysts whispered that mistakes in messages like this could determine the outcome of entire campaigns. Evelyn's fingers itched to start, yet a heavy weight settled in her chest, the knowledge that every decision she made in the next hours could ripple far beyond the walls of Arlington Hall. She glanced around the room. Colleagues hunched over their own ciphers, unaware of the critical significance of her task. Evelyn felt isolated in a way she had never experienced, as if the entire responsibility of preventing disaster rested solely on her and her team. Alice and Margaret approached silently, eyes steady, their quiet confidence a balm to her rising panic. There was no room for error. There could be no discussion of doubt. Failure here was not academic, it was existential. The first hurdle was sheer complexity. The cipher employed multiple layers, a primary substitution code, a rotating numeric key, and subtle modifications meant to mask timing and location. Evelyn leaned over the paper, her pencil trembling as she mapped out sequences, tested possible keys, and cross-referenced prior messages. Hours slipped by without notice. Her mind raced, calculations spinning, probabilities shifting, each step crucial. Even a momentary lapse could mislead interpretation, sending Allied forces into harm's way. By mid-morning, Evelyn detected a subtle irregularity, a pattern repeated every 17 characters, a sequence so small it would have gone unnoticed by anyone not attuned to cryptography's obsessive minutiae. Hard hammering, she traced the anomaly through several lines of the message. She shared her discovery with Alice and Margaret, who scrutinized it, nodded, and quickly adjusted their methods. The revelation was significant. This single insight might allow them to reconstruct the full instructions embedded in the code. The atmosphere in the room thickened. Cryptographers worked in near silence, punctuated only by the scratch of pencils, the occasional hum of machines, and the suppressed mutters of concentration. Evelyn noticed her own hands shaking as she transferred symbols, rearranged sequences, and tested variations. Fatigue clawed at her brain, but she ignored it. This message demanded her full attention. She imagined naval vessels sailing unknowingly into ambushes, lives depending on each calculation, each assumption. A flicker of fear burned in her chest, a sensation entirely different from the excitement of decoding earlier messages. It was responsibility, raw and unrelenting. Hours into the work, a small breakthrough occurred. Evelyn realized the key rotated not predictably, as most codes did, but in response to an external calendar system, Japanese lunar months and specific military schedules. She felt a thrill of comprehension, quickly translating the key into actionable data. Numbers became coordinates, symbols transformed into instructions, and she began to see the map the enemy had intended to hide. Yet triumph was fleeting. The decrypted segments implied that a surprise attack was imminent, targeting a convoy critical to Allied supply lines. The weight of that knowledge pressed on Evelyn in waves. She had uncovered a threat, but how to communicate it without revealing their own methods? The war demanded secrecy, too much transparency risked compromise. Her fingers hovered over the message, knowing that every word she wrote might be scrutinized, misinterpreted, or, if leaked, rendered the Allies vulnerable. As the day stretched into evening, tension mounted further. Evelyn noticed fatigue reflected in her colleagues' faces, the dark circles under eyes, the occasional slump of the shoulders, the minute shaking of hands. She understood that she, too, was nearing her limit. Yet the work could not stop. Lives waited in the shadows. Somewhere, sailors relied on cryptographers they would never know existed. Somewhere, men on distant islands counted on calculations carried out by minds like hers. By nightfall, the team had reconstructed the enemy's operational plan. It was painstaking work, every character double-checked, every interpretation verified. Evelyn reviewed the sequence one last time, aware that the smallest misstep could be catastrophic. Her heart raced as she realized that this message alone had the potential to change the fate of hundreds, maybe thousands, of people. The enormity of it pressed against her chest, a weight almost unbearable. When they finally transmitted their findings to naval intelligence, Evelyn felt a strange combination of relief and lingering fear. They could only wait now and trust that the information would be used wisely. She walked to the window, looking out over the quiet streets of Arlington Hall, the distant lights of the city shimmering like stars caught in a web of darkness. Outside, life continued unaware, unknowing, unaffected by the decisions made in this room. But inside, she and her team carried the invisible burden of survival, balancing intelligence against the chaos of war. Sleep was elusive that night. Evelyn lay awake, replaying every calculation, every step in the decoding process. Doubts whispered at the edges of her consciousness. Had she misread something? Could a single error undo all their efforts? She stared at the ceiling, imagining distant sailors maneuvering into positions her team had just uncovered, praying silently that their work was enough. The moral weight of secrecy pressed heavily. She could celebrate neither victory nor life saved, for the world outside must remain ignorant of their contribution. In the days that followed, the consequences of the decrypted message became apparent. Reports trickled in, convoys had been rerouted, attacks had failed, lives had been spared. Evelyn learned to measure success in absence, in unseen outcomes and unrecorded gratitude. There were no parades, no accolades, no recognition beyond quiet nods from her supervisors. Yet the impact was undeniable, a quiet triumph echoing across the Pacific, invisible but profound. Despite the exhaustion, Evelyn's confidence grew. She had survived the pressure, faced the weight of secrecy, and proven her ability to influence events far beyond her immediate world. Yet the experience left her acutely aware of the cost of information. Every cipher broken, every message interpreted, carried stakes beyond comprehension. Every success demanded vigilance, focus, and ethical courage. The war was no longer abstract, it existed in codes, in decisions, in silent nights when a single calculation could mean life or death. By the end of the week, Evelyn understood something fundamental: cryptography was not just about intellect, it was about responsibility. It required patience, moral clarity, and the capacity to bear burdens invisible to anyone outside the room. It demanded that she hold secrets tighter than her own heartbeat, that she trust her mind and instincts even when the world would never know. And most importantly, it demanded courage, the courage to face consequences she might never see, for people she would never meet. Evelyn gazed at her cipher sheets one last time before leaving the operations room, a quiet reverence in her eyes. These scraps of paper, lines of symbols, had saved lives. They had turned uncertainty into strategy, chaos into order. And though the recognition would never come, she felt something deeper, a sense of purpose, a knowledge that in the invisible world of codes and messages, she was fighting a war just as fiercely as those on distant battlefields. As she stepped into the cool night, Arlington Hall behind her, Evelyn understood that the cost of secrets was personal, heavy, and permanent. Yet she also knew she could bear it, because the work mattered more than sleep, comfort, or acknowledgement. In this hidden war, the brave were silent, and the consequences of courage unfolded far from prying eyes. Evelyn had crossed that threshold, and there was no turning back. Victory in silence. The war had raged for years, and Evelyn felt its weight in every step as she entered Arlington Hall that morning. The air smelled faintly of ink and paper, mingled with the metallic scent of the machines that hummed tirelessly. Outside, autumn leaves swirled along the walkways, indifferent to the invisible battles being fought inside. Evelyn clutched a fresh stack of messages, knowing instinctively that today's dispatch could determine whether months of sacrifice culminated in hope or despair. The team gathered quickly, each member already immersed in their own preliminary analysis. There was no room for hesitation. Codes had grown increasingly complex, enemies more cunning, and intelligence reports more urgent. Evelyn unfolded the first message, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar symbols. These were not just encrypted instructions, they were layered with misdirection, meant to confuse even the most experienced analysts. The sheer intricacy of the cipher made her pulse quicken, the stakes had never felt higher. Alice leaned over, whispering, "This one's different. The patterns are subtle, almost artistic." Evelyn understood instantly what she meant. Unlike the rigid, mechanical codes she had encountered before, this cipher seemed fluid, almost organic, shifting unpredictably, yet anchored by an underlying logic only discernible through relentless scrutiny. It was a puzzle crafted to test their limits. Hours passed in silent focus. Evelyn's pencil scratched rhythmically across sheets of paper as she mapped out possible keys, tested rotational sequences, and reconstructed partial phrases. Margaret worked beside her, her eyes scanning every anomaly, cross-referencing historical patterns, and flagging potential inconsistencies. Each breakthrough was tentative, each small success a fragile thread of progress. Yet Evelyn felt a growing clarity in her mind, a sense that the solution was just beyond reach, waiting to be coaxed into light. By late morning, they uncovered a segment that hinted at a major operation, a planned offensive that could disrupt supply lines critical to Allied forces in Europe. Evelyn's heart raced. The intelligence was invaluable, yet dangerous, revealing it could change the course of the war, yet misinterpreting it could invite catastrophe. She felt the familiar pressure settle into her chest, heavy and persistent. Every decision carried consequences beyond comprehension. Evelyn paused for a moment, staring at the sequence of letters and numbers. A fleeting doubt crept in: could they really decode this without error? Would their interpretation reach the right people in time? Then she reminded herself of everything she had learned over the past months: the patterns, the rotations, the nuances. She took a deep breath, centered herself, and began to reconstruct the cipher with renewed determination. By afternoon, the layers began to peel away. A subtle rotation keyed to daily meteorological reports revealed hidden messages, guiding them like a trail of breadcrumbs. Each discovery unfolded methodically: a partial coordinate here, a timing adjustment there, a note about troop movements elsewhere. Evelyn realized that the cipher had been designed not merely to obscure, but to test the discipline and persistence of those attempting to break it. Those who faltered would fail, those who persisted would see the truth emerge. As the pieces fell into place, a sense of awe washed over her. The code wasn't just a barrier, it was a story, a narrative of enemy intentions that had been deliberately hidden within layers of deception. Evelyn could visualize the strategies, the logistical calculations, the anticipated maneuvers. Every line she deciphered was a revelation, a moment of clarity piercing the fog of war. When the full message was finally reconstructed, Evelyn's hands trembled. The enemy planned a coordinated strike across multiple theaters, but the decoded instructions revealed vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Supply routes could be rerouted, defensive positions reinforced, and surprise attacks neutralized. This was the kind of intelligence that could tilt the balance of entire campaigns, and for the first time, Evelyn felt the profound weight of the role she and her colleagues had played. They submitted the final analysis to naval and Allied intelligence, knowing the response would be swift and decisive. Evelyn watched as her calculations were carried into operational plans, invisible but indispensable. There were no celebrations, no fanfare, only the quiet satisfaction of work done well, and the lingering awareness that the consequences of failure had been catastrophic. Days later, reports trickled in: enemy offensives had been thwarted, supply lines remained intact, and coordinated strikes had failed to achieve their objectives. Evelyn and her team quietly absorbed the knowledge, realizing that their decoding had directly influenced the outcome. In a war defined by destruction and chaos, they had carved out a sphere of order, a small but vital triumph in the shadows. Despite the victory, Evelyn felt an unusual mix of relief and melancholy. The war was far from over, yet for the first time, she sensed that their efforts had made a measurable difference. She understood that the work of cryptographers was not measured in medals or accolades, but in the lives preserved and the battles redirected, unseen yet powerful. The knowledge that her labor had tangible impact was both comforting and humbling. One evening, as she walked home through quiet streets lined with flickering lamps, Evelyn reflected on the journey she had taken. From the initial uncertainty and trepidation, through the intense nights of decoding, to the satisfaction of contributing to victory, she had grown in ways that went beyond skill or intellect. She had learned endurance, ethical responsibility, and the subtle art of patience. The war had demanded more than computation, it had demanded courage, clarity, and faith in herself. Returning to Arlington Hall one final time, Evelyn felt a quiet pride. She touched the stacks of cipher sheets, the pencils, the machines that had been her companions through months of invisible battle. She realized that the silent efforts of those like her had been as decisive as any victory won on a battlefield. In the invisible network of codes, messages, and intelligence, they had fought fiercely, bravely, and effectively without recognition, yet with undeniable impact. As the war neared its conclusion, Evelyn understood that her story and the stories of countless cryptographers would remain largely untold. The world would celebrate generals, soldiers, and victories, but few would ever grasp the magnitude of the silent struggles behind the scenes. She did not need acknowledgement. The knowledge that she had played a role in saving lives and shaping outcomes was reward enough. In the quiet aftermath, Evelyn felt a profound connection to history. She had witnessed the power of intellect over violence, of patience over haste, of precision over chaos. She had learned that sometimes the greatest victories were not marked by noise or celebration, but by subtle shifts in outcomes, preserved lives, and the enduring knowledge that human ingenuity could prevail even in the darkest of times. And as she finally set down her pencil, exhausted but fulfilled, Evelyn looked out over the city lights once more. The streets were calm, oblivious to the storms that had raged and been quietly mitigated by minds like hers. In the silence, she felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The war might end with guns and treaties, but in rooms like Arlington Hall, victories had been written in codes, executed in secrecy, and lived in quiet courage. Evelyn smiled faintly, knowing that, in the end, silence had its own power and she had wielded it wisely.